There was little recorded about his childhood, but we do know that he was the son of a small-time merchant and village mayor. And since he was a young boy, Gall had taken interest in facial and cranial functions. And his first observation was between two children in one of his classes. And these two children were known for their ability to memorize long text. And he also noticed that they had very prominent protruding eyes, so he associated memory with prominent eyes. His schooling, he first studied medicine in Strasbourg, and he focused on anatomy, and in 1785, he earned his medical doctorate in Vienna, and he ended up staying in Vienna for a while, where he held group discussions over psychological faculties, his observations, and experiments. So Franz Gall is known mostly for being the founder of Chronology, along with Johann Spurzheim, who was first his follower, then became his partner. And Chronology is a field of thought based on the idea that the brain is an organ of a person's mind, and personality traits are all located in a separate area of the brain, which can be measured by feeling bumps on a person's skull. So that'll become more easier as I explain throughout the slides. But as experiments, Gall would go to asylums, prisons, and even some houses where he would examine the patients and pay special attention to their skulls. Along with humans, he also dissected and analyzed animals' brains and skulls as well. He then would catalog specific mental characteristics that related with certain bumps on the skull. For example, he found that many pickpockets all have bumps in the same area on the side of their skull just above the ear. So he concluded that that part of the function of the brain held the power function, which was obviously too well developed in the pickpocket's brain, which caused a larger bump on the skull. And then lastly, getting a hold of the brains of the patients he studied was extremely important to him, because it meant that he was able to compare his observations to when they were alive, their observations of their personalities to when they were alive, to the structure of the brains after they died. So back to Chronology, it was based off of 5 basic principles. First, the brain is an organ of the mind. Second, human mental powers can be analyzed into a definite number of independent faculties or traits. Third, these faculties are natural and each has a definite region on the surface of the brain. Fourth, the size of each region is a measure of the degree to which the faculty seated in it forms a central element in the character of an individual. And what that means is if a person is extremely prideful, that part of the brain that pride resides in will reflect a larger bump on the skull. And fifth, the correspondence between the outer surface of the skull and the form of the brain surface beneath is sufficiently close to enable the observer to recognize the relative size of the several organs by the examination of the outer surface of the head. So I know that's really confusing, but in simpler terms, the size of the skull relates to the size of the brain. And Gall believed that, the bigger the skull, the bigger the brain, the smaller the skull, the smaller brain, and that was, his thoughts on it. So Gall was able to categorize certain traits that correlated with certain areas and bumps on the skull and the brain. He found 27 functions or traits that he believed that each of these traits reside in a specific area of the brain, and the skull would reflect that through bumps that would appear on if the traits were well developed, or small mutations if they were less developed. So back to the pickpocketers, the power function, they had a larger bump, whereas other people, it was just a small mutation. Like I said earlier, he also dissected animals' brains and skulls as well as humans, and he found 27 traits that correlated with specific regions in the brain, and the first 19 were qualities shared with humans and animals, and they were sexual instinct, love of offspring, friendship, instinct for self-defense, instinct to kill, cunningness, desire to possess things, pride, vanity, foresight, memory for things, sense of place, memory for people or creatures, memory for words, sense of language, color sense, sense of musical tones, recognition of numbers, and mechanical sense. And the qualities just unique to humans were comparative sagacity, I can't say that, metaphysical spirit, wit, joking, poetic ability, moral sense, conscience, mimicking religious instincts, and firmness and stubbornness. And this picture really helps, describe what he meant by each 27 trait really were located in specific regions, and so that was his model that he used. His writings in 1791, he first published a treatise on the philosophy of medicine, and this gained him many interested followers in him and phrenology. In 1798, he was able to publish his doctrine in a widely known German journal, which was, really big for him. And in 1810, he published a book titled Anatomy and Physiology of the Nervous System in general, and of the brain in particular. And this just consisted of his lectures, his theories, and his main idea that the brain function relates to the shape of a person's skull. His beliefs: he was very pessimistic and had a cynical view on life. He even designated one of the functions of the brain as murder. And he also was a determinist and believed that powers are inborn and cannot be changed. So basically, he believed that we aren't able to make choices or control what happens due from some past event in our lives. His critiques: even though Gall had many followers, he also had a few critics. One of the reasons was many thought his theories contradicted with the church and their beliefs. Religious leaders of the Catholic Church thought he was questioning God creating us and our personalities, but really he was just explaining God's work. And in 1802, the Austrian government banned his lectures because it was contrary to religion, and 3 years later he was kicked out of the country. And the Catholic Church also put his book, along with his lectures being banned, they also put his books on the church's index of prohibited books. But even though he was kicked out of the country, it wasn't his downfall, because he ended up having a really successful tour lecturing throughout Europe. Another reason he had critics were there were holes in his theory due from his lack of knowledge. At the time, there was no knowledge of the brain being asymmetrical, and so phrenologists viewed the two halves of the brain to be copies of each other. But in reality, we know today that that's not true. And his knowledge of anatomy and biology were not very well as they should have been, so that caused some of his theories to not match up. And that's why today phrenology is known as a pseudoscience, because even though some of his theories were scientific, not all of them were, and some of them were really incorrect. His discoveries, along with his partner for his time, Gall was able to find that gray matter is the source and the nutrition of the neurofibers in the nervous system. And he also was able to find the difference between gray matter and white matter. The picture of the gray matter is the darker area, and the white matter is obviously the lighter area. They also established a path of the pyramidal fibers from the medulla oblongata to the cerebral cortex. And he also was acknowledged for discovering the cervical and lumbar enlargements in the nervous system being uneven. So all these discoveries caused Gall to become the main contributor to neuroscience, which is a branch of life sciences that deals with anatomy, physiology, biochemistry of molecular biology of nerves and nervous tissues, and especially with relation to behavior and learning. And so as you can tell, these discoveries all dealt with the anatomy of the body and the brain. His contributions to psychology: he made his work and studies attainable through books and lectures, and he also conducted experiments dissecting brains and analyzing skulls, and he did this in order to correlate our personalities to different sections of our brain. And he also found that the brain contained many parts that all had certain special functions, but as an organ did not function as a whole. So what he ultimately brought to psychology is that our behaviors deal with the functions of our brain. His influence on psychology: he was able to influence others to take a closer look at the brain in order to explain and learn more about a person's behavior. And his work was also able to help start neurology, which again deals with the study of the nervous system. And neurology is basically a more perfected research form of phrenology with other elements of anatomy and biology. And that's it. Is there any questions, any comments?
I don't hurt on me. What was good about it?
Everything, start to finish. Didn't really look on the thing you do what you're talking about. Very good.
Thank you. Thanks.
It's spontaneous, wasn't it? Your comments were spontaneous.
If you had to choose one of his contributions, which would you say was the biggest to psychology?
I would say that his idea, of realizing that our personalities just aren't, what we choose, that it kind of deals with our brain and our functions. that the instinct to do things. It's not just just because we want it. We're born like that. We're kind of wired like that. So I think that's pretty cool. He's able to correlate between the two.
Did you guys hear quite a few contributions to psychology? Yeah. He's one of the first people that, I hesitate to say this because it sounds like the other people we've studied before weren't, but he more of a science, approached it as a science.
Mm-hmm.
Did you see anything about Florence in there when you were doing your research? His partner, I'm not saying you should have, I'm just saying, actually it's in the textbook, but Florence came alongside of him and sort of was a student with him, and then ended up taking over his business, or turned it into a business.
Oh, no, I didn't see that. I only saw was Johann Spurzheim.
It's quite a, I encourage you guys when you're reading that to notice it, and it's in the part where they talk about what he contributed in this book, in the Habershall book. It's in the part where he talks about what he contributed to psychology. But to say that, you said that he has a few critics, that was probably an understatement, because
Yeah.
but the problem was, it wasn't so much him as his partners that came along and turned it into a service. And then they started producing machines to measure the bumps on your head, and and just to make money, and they didn't follow his scientific methods. But yeah, that really struck me when I read it. And if you guys, I'll tell you what, if you know who's going to speak and you read the chapter, at least that part of the chapter ahead of time, it'll give you make it a lot more interesting for you. But that, anybody else have any questions, or did you miss anything that you wanted to fill in? Number one. What was read it. What's the first question?
Oh, what's the connection between the specific elements a person's life views he or she held beyond that to report it becomes stuff.
Wait, can I see the question? Can I see it? I think also with the belief side, that's what I kind of meant. He was very pessimistic. I mean, he didn't have an optimistic view of it all. So he kind of affected his research and his documenting all those 27 traits and stuff. But is that answer it? I don't know. The first question kind of confused me.
Like some of them had childhoods that affected why they did what they did.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how much they gave us on that in your book anyway. Was he the one that had very little was known about him? I always forget stuff like that and get mixed up. Well, no, he's childhood. You did it. You said it. He noticed his friends had protuberant eyes, and it made him start thinking about the brain. So that's how he started his investigation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you did it. That's what that question means. It means
when what started it. Okay.
yeah, and it's actually in the syllabus too. That's how the papers are supposed to be, or in the presentations too. What about their lives would have led them possibly to this direction?
Yeah, that was his first observation between the other kids in his class, with the prominent eyes and the good memory.
Anybody else? Let me just say a couple of things about your presentation that I want to point out to everybody. Did you notice that she made an explanation of the one part? She said, that's really hard to get, and then she explained it in her own words. That's a very good, that gives it extra points. If you refer to the source, I didn't hear her say this, but if you refer to the source, like in Habershall says that, or some of your other sources in there, if you refer to them, that means that's extra points on this. Creativity, The slides, a lot of you had that already, and I need to go back and add some points to some of yours because I just thought of that when I was reading it. If you add a biblical concept, that gives you extra points. Engaging the audience, what does that mean? I mean, in a sense, you did engage us because we all paid attention, and I mean, the spontaneous response was, "That's pretty good." But what would that mean in another sense? How would you get engagement? Come on, somebody's got to know this. You've been in my class before. Asking questions, getting the audience to participate. So it might even be, you could do a little pre-test, or you could just say, how many of you have heard, you make some example at the beginning, or at the end. You could say, now how many of you could tell me, you could have a little verbal quiz or something, you know, and I know students don't like to do that because that really ticks off the other students because they feel like, you know, you're putting them on the spot, but nobody's going to get in trouble. It's just more or less, because you're going to give them the answers anyway. It's a way to keep people's interest going. But obviously you did that in some sense because you did, because of the way that you presented it. So let's give her a hand.
I forget to shut this off.